Ran is the powerful sea goddess of the northern European peoples. Half woman, half fish, she embodies the sinister side of the oceans and causes mighty storms on the seas, also known as Ran's Way. Ran is the ruler of a realm of the dead, full of drowned sailors. In their coral caves, illuminated with glittering gold, the drowned live on as they once did on earth, and are spoiled with food and mead in abundance. So desired is the entrance into their realm that all sailors have gold coins in their pockets to be able to pay their obolus to the gold-obsessed ruler. Her 9 daughters are also called the Claws of Ran. They are wave-like creatures that make the seas roar with their fish tails so that Ran can collect the sailors drowned in their nets. Sometimes, however, the capricious Ran simply pulls unsuspecting sailors from aboard their ships down to the bottom of the sea. The translation of her Old Norse name is therefore the robber.
I do believe that the Vikings lost 50% at sea or more. The North Atlantic is a cruel ocean. You must have a lot of confidence in yourself. Above all, you must have confidence in your ship and know it inside out.
But it is not the North Atlantic on which I spent my summer, but the much more peaceful Baltic Sea. Shortly before Midsummer Night, I think back here on Stegskjer, a remote island in the Åland archipelago, to the experiences of the last few months and to my way up here. Almost exactly a year ago, I came across a hint at the oldest route description for the Baltic Sea. I took a look at the original document in the National Archives in Copenhagen and learned there that this route description from southern Sweden to Tallinn, called King Valdemar Sailing Route, goes back at least to the time of the Vikings. This was followed by visits to various Viking museums, interviews with experts, an intensive familiarization with the Vikings, and a careful route planning. 10 weeks ago, in mid-April, I untied my lines in the old Viking settlement of Haithabu and entered the eastern Swedish archipelago via Korseberga and the Kalmar Sound. For weeks now, I have been living and sailing in this unique nature and enjoy my freedom here while following the tracks of the Norsemen. On the way, I have become more and more intensively involved with the mythology and especially the navigational methods of the Vikings. Mark by mark, I could tick off all the place names given in the itinerary, because the dreamlike summer has not demanded any great nautical achievements from me so far. As the Stockholm archipelago slowly begins to fill up during summer, I sailed a long distance, as indicated in the old route description, over the Sea of Åland to Stegskjer. One of the islands that I liked so much on my first trip to Scandinavia that I really wanted to come back. I found a wonderful mooring at this skerry on the last evening and celebrated my farewell to these incredible islands. In the Åland Islands, I had felt like a millionaire of time. And so, 4 years later, I am back at my old archipelago berth, looking forward to exploring the Åland Islands. The whole atmosphere here seems like from another world, or rather like at the end of the world. The only thing missing is the Rainbow Bifrost, which connects Midgard, the world of the humans, with Asgard, the world of the gods.
And it just reminds me of one story I read about the god and giant of the seas, Aegir. He got 9, I would say, beautiful daughters. The old one-eyed guy, Odin, managed to get each of them pregnant in just one night. And astonishingly, they only born one child out of this. This child was
Heimdall, who is blessed with many divine talents. He needs less sleep than a bird, sees for 100 miles by day and night, and hears the grass on the earth and the wool on the sheep growing. Thus, he was given the task to protect the kingdom of the Aesir as the guardian of Bifrost. Heimdall impresses not only with his ingenuity, but also with his beauty, adorned as he is with his shining golden teeth.
That is where the German saying, "the early morning has gold in its mouth," derives.
You can always see Heimdall with his Gjallarhorn, with which he warns the gods of the rising enemies at the Vikings' doomsday, the Ragnarok.
First, my landfall on the Åland Islands and Copperclinter is upcoming. It is the Åland Statue of Liberty for sailors.
Old venerable gentlemen have sat here and wept. When they used to go out into the world as sailors, they never dreamed that one day they would sit here on Copperclinter and have a glass of wine.
There's only a small jetty here, and the approach is very narrow, shallow, and to be navigated with caution. A few years ago, the large pyramid-shaped beacon was rebuilt true to the original. However, I could not clarify the meaning of the barrel as a top sign. Everywhere on Copperclinter one encounters sculptures. On the balcony of the old pilot's house, for example, there is a pilot with binoculars who, as in former times, looks far out over the open sea for ships. Then there's the famous sculpture of the painting lighthouse keeper. The operators of the small cafe have also distributed further sculptures of various birds all over the island. Copperclinter really has an incredible atmosphere, and I get a little wistful when I see the island disappearing aft. But that changes quickly when I reach my old dream destination on Stegskær. The next morning, fog drifts into the bay. I have never had that here in the archipelago before, and I definitely don't want it here either. In these narrow and rocky fairways, just waiting for a little mistake. So I have a long breakfast and wait for the early morning fog to lift before I cast off the lines. But it comes quite differently. Under these conditions, I can only rely on my tablet, because the buoys and rocks, and other ships too, can only be seen extremely late.
Through the archipelago and the fog, also something completely new. This is how it looks on the picture, and this is how it looks in reality.
When mooring, a little bit of wind finally blows the view free again. Rødham is an old pilot island too, and you will find an uninhabited pilot house here. Repeatedly, the big ferries pass here in the fog, and still have pilots on board nowadays. The whole island is littered with red stones, which were arranged by the countless visitors to towers or most different stone settings. But one also must pay attention where one steps. And indeed, I see many of these, although non-venomous, snakes on the island.
Today I went to Rødham, and here I'm on a separate island. It's called Rødu because here's an old labyrinth made of stones and the remains of a medieval chapel. And to get here, I reactivated my kayak.
There was once a footbridge that connected the islands, but now this path is blocked. The first thing that stands out is the white beacon made of stones. In the age of the GPS, these sea marks are becoming less and less important. Next to the beacon, I find another one of the many stone labyrinths in Scandinavia, which are also called Troy towns. It is assumed that most of these labyrinths are from the late Middle Ages. There are numerous theories about the meaning of these labyrinths. However, the great number on the coasts of Finland and Estonia and on the east coast of Sweden seems to roughly coincide with the route of the sea itinerary. But whether cult or children's playground, there is always a great fascination emanating from these ancient stone settings. In Finland, I later learned that one should run into such a labyrinth forwards and then backwards to get rid of evil spirits. Still, you can hear the foghorns of the big ferries. But slowly the curtain rises and reveals all the beauty of the Åland Islands. The search for the dilapidated church is also successful, but it takes some imagination to see it figuratively. Since the late Middle Ages, seafaring and church belonged inseparably together, also here in Scandinavia. While for a relative long time the Vikings in the East still believed in the old Nordic gods, Christianity was already completely established in the times of King Valdemar. And so, I do not have to strain my imagination too long, as in Lemböte, the next place mentioned in the itinerary, I find a completely restored seafarers' church from the time of King Valdemar. Once dilapidated, it now serves for church services here in the lonely forest. At that time it was closer to the water, but the land uplift here on the Åland Islands has raised it by a massive 8 meters. Once again, it is great to travel through time and on the traces of my seafaring predecessors. Was it therefore possible that the old route description in King Valdemar's Cadaster have had a completely different purpose?
The calendar in the manuscript has a couple of Franciscan saints. It has been suggested that this manuscript was actually written by a member of the Franciscan order, and that the inclusion of this sailing route from Utlänge to Tallinn was in order to facilitate missionary travels by Danish Franciscans to Estonia, which at the time when this manuscript was written was part of the Kingdom of Denmark.
And also in Finnish research, the old route description reflects the itineraries of the Franciscan monks who were familiar with the archipelago and the sea. Thus, this itinerary represents a rare source that smells a little bit of sea salt in the last third. For the first time, direct courses for a journey across the open sea are also given here.
It should be noted that from Arholma to Lemböte one sails a northeasterly course, and one could, if there is a favourable wind from the west, sail a direct line from Arholma to Hangu.
The description of the sailing route seems to indicate that it is composed of several different descriptions that have been amalgamated into one.
After all the church visits, I hope that I now have enough spiritual succor to prepare for an adventure that has been burning under my nails for 4 years now.
There are many small islands and rocks, and there's no official route there. But in this book, Åland, which helps me a lot in planning, I found that there is a route called Seebären route. I don't know how to translate it. It's like sea bears.
Between Kjöka and Lemböte, there are many islands called Föglö.
And it's a non-marked seaway, which is only recommended for people with local knowledge. And 2014 I learned about it.
After numerous emails, I had reached the lovely Finn Christian, who provided me with information and material and confirmed the feasibility of my route. of course without guarantee. The usual way through the island archipelago leads through this marked passage. I would like to avoid this detour and sail through the completely unbuoyed island world of Vögler, as described in the route description. With now 8 meters less water under the keel due to the land elevation, the 12 lonely nautical miles through the wilderness are not without danger nowadays. But I feel well prepared, and if necessary, I have a kayak and a handheld echo sounder with me.
There are 2 very tight spots, and I will explore them with my kayak before and the echo sounder, just to be sure that I'm on the right way. And this is why I need less wind.
But first, I set course for the starting point of my little adventure and head for the island of Björke. On the way, I meet the protected provincial bird of the Åland Islands, a mighty sea eagle, which flies with white wings and a wingspan of up to 2.5 meters, even over the Åland Europe stamp. But the Vikings obviously had another use for the national bird. In Haithabu and Berka, 2-hole flutes made of sea eagle bones were found. How widespread these were among the Vikings is another question, however, as there are no musical records from the time. But many Arab travelers have described the frequent use of instruments in Viking rituals. The musical performance was accompanied by rough lyrics, and so it was said about a visit to Haithabu.
I have never heard more dreadful singing than that of the Schleswig people, and it is a droning that comes out of their throats like the barking of dogs, only much more bestial. There is also an artificially produced eye makeup. When they use it, beauty never diminishes, but rather increases in men and women.
Obviously, not much has changed in the music in the far north since then. The first ever found fragment of a Nordic song from the 13th century comes along much softer and is translated as "I dreamed a dream." In Denmark, this passage is generally known as a pause sign on the radio, and this song was also used in the television series Vikings. With these sounds in my ears, I then moor la mer at the far end of the jetty, where the water is just deep enough for my boat.
Between Lembütte and Vögler, there are many islands. And I want to go right through them.
The islands are mine for the rest of the day. I go on an exploration tour and get an overview from the observation tower. It is always a great feeling to see my boat swimming there, lonely at the jetty. I then find an old pilotage place with a view over the windy sea. For they are so important pilot services, the settlements were exempted from tax duty and military service. Even though life on such a small island cannot have been easy, it was always better than military service. And the taxes saved could certainly be put to good use. I want to set off with the first light, because that is when there is usually the least wind and swell, and I surely cannot use waves on my expedition through this shallow rock world. My kayak gets a patch and is tested extensively. The wind also dies down slowly and gives way to a wonderful evening mood.
And the next thing is I will go through the archipelago tomorrow, through all the islands and islets. And yeah, it's quite challenging. Far off the marked routes. It's not the first time that I do this, but This time it's 12 miles, so it's quite long.
The evening here at the end of the world is once again fascinating, and the rainbow makes me think of Bifrost and the transition to the world of the gods again. Am I really that close to them here? Has Heimdall already set his sights on me? Or is the cunning, devious and unpopular Loki spinning his wickedness once again? For it is not for nothing that no one named his children after him, and there are not even places that bear his name.
Loki is a child of the giants and therefore not a god of the Aesir, but a blood brotherhood with Odin binds him closely to the gods. The insidious Loki is not well regarded by the Aesir, for he repeatedly puts them in danger with his escapades, but just as often his deceptions are the last resort from the enemy giants. With the giantess Angrboda, the one who brings grief, he fathers the three arch-enemies of man and the gods. And these are Hel, the Fenris wolf, and the Midgard serpent. When Odin takes in these three as young children from Angrboda to keep a better eye on them, she does not shed a tear. Hel is appointed guardian of the realm of those who die of sickness or old age. The Midgard serpent is given the task of holding the mighty ocean around Midgard. The Fenris wolf, however, grows larger and more dangerous every day. To tame him, the gods order the dwarves to manufacture restraints which may look inconspicuous but are unbreakable. Strange are the components from which the dwarves weave this magic thread. The beard of the women, the sound of the cat's foot, the voice of the fish and the roots of the mountains. And Loki is also tied to the rocks with his son's intestines when he falls from grace with the Aesir. At Ragnarok, the end of the Viking world, Loki and the Fenris wolf both tear themselves away. Loki dies in a battle with Heimdall. Thor and the Midgard serpent he hates so much kill each other. The Fenris wolf devours Odin in battle. But Odin's son Vidar then kills the wolf and is one of the few survivors of Ragnarok. For the course of the Nordic world continues, even after its downfall. And so too do the dark powers survive. And it is written,
"From below the dragon dark comes forth. Nidhugger flying from Nidafjöll. The bodies of men on his wings he bears. The serpent bright, now he's sinking."
I do not really sleep well after all those doomsday visions.
I really did spend the whole night now dreaming of my boat being crushed by the waves.
And I need a strong coffee first to wake up. But after I have untied the lines, one of the most beautiful cruises of the whole journey begins, through the absolute desolation of the Åland South.
You just gotta look back and remember what we're made of.
I am happy about the calm morning sea and feel like a real explorer.
Storms are raging, I will hold you close tonight, and I won't let go until the morning light. I'll stay by your side. There's so much more to you than what meets the eye. A beauty that goes deeper than the surface. I've waited my whole life to find someone who gives love a purpose. I'll stay by your side. Storms are raging, I will hold you close to
Some passages require a careful navigation, but in the end, the meticulous planning proves its worth, and my kayak is not needed. Given this rock rising steeply underwater here, anchoring would be impossible anyway. I've made it! I found the South Passage.
Until the morning light.
Yes, I made it. I found the passage south of Högl, and I must say it was one of the most wonderful sailing trips I've ever made. Absolutely pure nature, nobody there, no single soul, no boat, no nothing. And it was much easier than I expected, and I was wondering why. And it is because all of the planning, and I made a route and I put it in Navionics based on all the information I got in advance. And I just follow the route, which is quite easy with Navionics. And yeah, it just fits perfect.
On my way to the last island of the Åland archipelago, I passed the church of Sandvik, which marked the turning point on my first trip. In a church on Kyrkja, I started brooding. What had my friend Michael told me a few years ago?
Yeah, Klaus, what's left for us? Maybe 20 more summers.
Yes, and so I thought about my own transience and was suddenly ready for returning. But this time I want to go further east. The entry into my last harbor on the Åland Islands with the somewhat dark buoys will then prove even more difficult than crossing my South Passage, which I discovered earlier. My motto to pay special attention shortly before arriving at the destination again proves to be true, and I moor safely in the harbor of Kyrkja. But somehow I don't get really warm with port and town. Maybe I am already on the way to Finland in my thoughts. Anyway, I conscientiously get myself a package of Åland brown bread, which is advertised as a local specialty. But in the end, I am glad when it is finally eaten up after a few days and the help of many beverages. Since my kayak is already inflated, I spend the rest of the day paddling. Remains of boat sheds were also found in excavations in Viking settlements in Norway and Iceland. The Viking apparently loved his boat as an everyday means of transportation just as much as we love our car, which is protected in the garage today. However, up to now there have only been 2 finds of large shipyards. Otherwise, the boats were built in the forests in front of their own door, and in the Viking sagas, many heroes are described as knowledgeable boat builders. First, the keel and the clinkered planks were set, and only then were the boats elastically stiffened from the inside, so that the hull could adapt to the swell. Finally, the removable dragon head had to be attached to frighten the land spirits. And also, a piece of umber must not be missing on board, because it brings luck. When the tears of the goddess Freya hit rocks, they turned into gold. But if they fell into the water, they turned into umber. That is why umber is also called the tears of the goddess of the veins. And once again, it is time to cast off and set sails for another nation. For the first time, the flag of Finland is now flying on the mast, and I'm overly excited about the country unknown to me. Mentioned in the old route description, there are now 3 islands lying close together.
There are 3 islands, one of which is Aspu, the other Refholm, and the third Malmö. Jormu is the southernmost island near the open sea.
On the horizon, the sky mixes with the sea.
I'm thinking about the last 4 years and about my decision to making music and traveling my life. And I'm really happy that I listened to my heart in that case. And yeah, I just listened to the album I wrote, I composed and produced on my last journey 4 years ago. And yeah, it's a very good feeling when I'm thinking about all the people I met through the music and the traveling, and yeah, felt like I made everything right.
In contrast to the Åland Islands, the waters here are wider, and you almost feel like you are on the open sea. Sailing could not be more beautiful, and I feel as if I have arrived at the actual destination of my journey.
Like coming home. Yes, it feels like coming home again. On a rainy afternoon. Yes, it feels like coming home. It feels like coming home again.
I just want to share some thoughts about the nutrition in the Middle Ages. And I just wondered why spices are so valuable, and that ships went around the world just for pepper. And I just read a book about that, and there were no tomatoes, there were no potatoes. So mostly food was made out of vegetables, and rye, wheat and salt was used as a payment. I can really understand why in these times people are willing to pay such high prices for that.
And it feels like coming home. Yes, it feels like coming home again.
I arrive at the island of Jurmø, which according to the itinerary is the closest to the sea. When entering the windy harbor, my lines are taken, as it is usual in Scandinavia. And I'm also happy about my, as a precaution, previously extended stern line.
I'm here on my first Finnish waypoint on the island of Jurmø, and by approaching I didn't like it so much. It looked a bit boring, reminds me of Western Denmark. And after running around here for several hours, I really fell in love with this island, and I will show you why.
One building houses the port office, a supermarket, and a pub with a huge collection of international liquor bottles. Here, the public life of the island takes place. People come and go to the rhythm of the ferry that connects Jurmø with the outside world. Everything has its time, there are no cars, and everyone is on foot. In the shop there are many products made of South American alpaca wool. Very unusual for Finland, I think. But I learned that a farmer here in Jurmø is breeding some alpacas. And since I want to have a closer look at the island and at the alpacas, I decided to go there. And like the rest of the islanders, I set off on foot. I immediately noticed that the landscape appears much rougher and has less and less in common with the summery Swedish archipelago. On Jurmø, the scent of blooming heath hangs over everything. I cannot get enough of the lush nature and walk up to the other end of the island, where once again a very idyllically located church is standing.
Winter chill and the snow is falling on the cedar
The ship models hanging from the ceiling of the small, lovingly decorated church make my sailor's heart beat faster. And in this atmosphere, as at the end of the world, I also understand a little better the worldview of the Vikings.
For the Vikings, the earth was a circular disc surrounded by the sea. In the center was Midgard, protected from the other worlds by a wall made of the eyebrows of the giant Ymir. The people lived among a multitude of the most diverse and invisible beings. They were not, however, considered supernatural, but were a real part of their world. And there were the Völvas, respected and feared priestesses with their knowledge of the beginning and the end of the world.
Women obviously had better contact with the supernatural, and so even Odin sought advice from the Völvas with their painted faces, surrounded by amulets and talismans. Their burial places were ritual places, in which a magic stick was always found, because Völva means staff carrier. I then have a look at the patient alpacas and already begin to take Finland into my heart.
Ja, beweg dich, baby. Yeah, move it, baby.
A love that should deepen with every day of the journey. I let the day come to an end and sail further east the next morning.
Super relaxed sailing today. Yeah, there are only a few islands, but mostly water. The exact opposite of the other islands. They're quite charming. Something different now.
Once again, I pass a shipwreck here near Egilssker. The prevailing winds were also in the Middle Ages, southwest to west. The open sea was mostly avoided. But here, between the islands mentioned in the itinerary, it feels just like being on the open sea.
Very much the opposite is the case with the Egilssker wreck. The entire ship capsized, all of its cargo scattered across the seabed. So we can say for sure that there was some kind of major accident.
The port of destination can only be guessed at, but Tallinn, the most important city of Reval on the Gulf of Finland at that time, seems likely for a long-distance trader.
For 14 days, the Estonians fought doggedly against a large army for the Toompea castle in Reval. But when they saw 4 approaching cogs on the sea, they left the Toompea castle, went to their ships, and returned to Ösel.
Both Tallinn and Ösel, today called Saaremaa, are still on my way, and I hope I will not meet the same fate as the cog lying here under me. Therefore, I always make a careful route planning before every journey, which looks something like this.
I use everything I could get to get as most information as possible. So I use regular charts, then these books, harbor guides and tour guides and stuff, and also my Navionics software, of course. And then I try to find waypoints which will make sense with the wind directions, and then I put each and every waypoint in my Navionics software. It's a nice concentration to what I do the next day.
Today's route planning brings me reliably to the marina of Rossalla after some wonderful archipelago sailing. My experiments with the sundial compass on the way to the islands were still in need of improvement.
I filled this handle with stones, which is much better in the waves to keep this device downward. Yeah, and then it occurred to me that this disc needs to be absolutely plain. So this is not easy here with my limited tools. So I will ask a friend of mine in Germany, Mr. Folkboat himself.
Ah, the Viking sailor.
Don't get scared. You're live on the Viking Route movie production. I just want to ask you a question. I need a disc for my sundial compass with 8 centimeter in diameter, 1 centimeter thick, and a small hole in the middle.
Yeah, I'll figure something out.
In a few days, I will fly to Germany for 4 weeks and pick up the new compass disc from Mike. But it's not time yet, and I set off on foot to spend the night at a very special place.
I'm here in Rosala at the Viking Center in Finland. After a 1,000-mile journey from Haithabu over Birka in the Öresund nearby, there were many founds of the Viking age.
Rosala is not a museum in the classical sense, but an incredibly special world of experiences.
We've been working with this museum for a little over 25 years now, and the idea is to bring alive, you could say, the history in the eastern route here in the Finnish archipelago, and there's been found over 1,000 artifacts here on this island. So this eastern route here through these parts of the island, what was called Öresund during the Viking Age also. It was mentioned first in King Valdemar's itinerary. There was a big marketplace that was established here on this island during the Viking Age.
The highlight for me will be the planned Viking banquet and the big festival hall in the evening. There are other guests present who will also spend the night in the dormitories at the edges of the hall. Such a festival hall often formed the center of every larger Viking settlement. And in Nordic mythology, there is also such a large hall in Odin's castle, the famous Valhalla, whose roof consists of shields resting on spears.
And on the roof of Valhalla lies the goat Heidrun, feeding on the leaves of the world ash tree Yggdrasil. She produces mead, which flows from its udder directly into the cups and helmets of the warriors. In his enormous royal hall, illuminated by the shining swords, Odin lives with his wife Frigg. Odin is enthroned, mighty and majestic, on his high seat, while his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, tell him about the course of the world. Every evening the same boar is prepared, and the face of Valhalla's cook is already so black that he is known as Sooty Face.
However, the cook here is a she and does not lack humor. But before the feast begins, I have plenty of time to look around. There are replicas of historical musical instruments. The reproduction of a loom, and various types of jewelry. Outside, I discover a big catapult. These catapults with counterweight were designed at the end of the Viking Age. They were shot with stones or burning logs. But epidemics with infected carcasses could also be spread. I occupy myself with the replicas of some typical weapons of the Viking Age. The most common was the knife, which every free Viking, man or woman, always carried with him. Therefore, there are many knife finds, also of the unique designed and shaped sax, which was especially developed for fighting. Not only in war, but also during hunting, bow and arrow were indispensable for the Vikings. So many arrowheads were also found, here in Russala, even in the middle of a skull. At the end of the Viking Age, the crossbow, invented in China, found its way to the north. It could only shoot 100 meters, but the heavy arrows penetrated helmets and shields and could even kill 2 enemies at the same time. Axes were certainly most widespread, as they belonged to every household and were easy to make. Swords were probably less common, and the quality was so bad in the beginning that they often had to be rebent in battle. Then there were different spears, a short-bladed spear, throwing spear, or as thrusting spear. Quite common was the shield for defense. It consisted of wooden parts reinforced and kept in shape with metal, often simply painted red, the color of battle. Elaborate paintings were only reserved for the leaders. There are also often rumors that the shields on board ships were used to increase the freeboard as protection against the waves. But sailing legend Burkhard Piske has not only circumnavigated the world several times in his self-built catamaran Shangri-La, he has gone much further than me in the matter of Vikings and has sailed in a replica Viking ship with only 3-man crew via Iceland and Greenland to New York. And he made the following experience with the shields.
To me, this is sheer nonsense about increasing freeboard with shields. But these shields were always to be seen on drawings of the Viking ships. Basically, they always had a military background. When a Viking ship goes into the rivers, the local people knew, okay, they were on a robbery. And the oarsmen hid behind the shields for protection, even on the water. Increasing freeboard with the waves that hit us on the side, we tried that once and we lost 4 shields. This was our first encounter in the Sky Garrick, where we lost 4 shields after 1 wave. And the shields have to be fixed completely differently. They would have to be bolted to the boat to increase the freeboard. It is all taken from old drawings or historical tradition that the Vikings sailed the seas protected behind these shields. They certainly did not do that.
You always have to be careful what you hear and read. I also asked him about his experiences with the sundial compass, which he had also copied.
I wanted to try out the solar compass, which is documented by the Vikings, which is proven. But from Europe to America, the sky was practically overcast. I could not tell if we were sailing the latitude that you can sail with the solar compass. Well, the experiment is still open, but my successors, they must do that. I definitely will not do it.
Here, in the solitude of the Finnish archipelago, between the wooden buildings and the constant smell of the open fire, I like to be carried away and play like a little boy. Then there's the symbolic recreation of a pagan altar with the bones of animal sacrifices. But one also finds the reconstruction of an early church. The slow transition to Christianity is an important aspect of the Viking Age. In the beginning, Christianity was often adopted parallel to the old gods. There are also finds of amulets or molds from Mjolnir, the magic hammer of Thor, with an additional worked-in cross, true to the motto, the more the merrier. But even in the days of the week, the old gods still live on today. Because the Germanic tribes simply replaced the weekdays, which are named after Roman gods, with the names of their own. Finally, there's also a, albeit very symbolic, replica of a Viking ship.
The Viking ships in general are specific for the need they made.
Conveniently, in the fjord of Roskilde in Denmark, a selection of the boat types that were common at the time was found, which are now exhibited in the Viking Ship Museum there. Thus, the find numbers 1 to 3 were of the short, wide and very spacious Knarr, the merchant ships of the Vikings, which were significantly involved in the settlement of the North Atlantic islands and brought the Vikings to North America. They can almost be compared with today's container ships, because even in those days there was a kind of container system where barrels or bathtub-like troughs were placed on universally suitable racks on board. That these were then also used as coffins speaks for the pragmatism of the Vikings. Then there were small cargo ships for protected waters, and even smaller ones for fishing in everyday life, such as the find number 4. There were very few ports then. Usually there was at most a jetty, if not the boat was simply pulled ashore. And finally, there were the well-known long and narrow warships, carrying many warriors and oars on board. Found number 5 is such a long ship with enough space for 50 to 60 warriors. Here in Rosala, I like once again the possibility to enter the ship and go on a mental journey. It must have been exhausting work to move such a boat under oars while living on the open deck. You can also see the clubs that close the rudder holes when the sea is rough. But then I'm rudely torn from my daydreams. Because the cow horn, used by the Vikings for many purposes, blows for the feast, and my journey of thoughts gets another dimension. With wooden crockery and cutlery, I set out for a buffet of fish, meat and lots of vegetables. Everything is smoked or somehow tastes of smoke. In addition, they have a special beer here, which soon brings me to the sleeping places at the edges of the hall, just like the other guests. It was an absolutely wonderful evening, which I will surely remember for a long time. A visit to this museum should be on the to-do list of every sailor cruising in Finland. Last but not least, I reverentially visit a monument standing here on the island, dedicated to the seafarers who stayed on the sea. And I promise myself to stay concentrated until the end of my journey. Then I also allow myself a few days off from the old route description and dive into the world of the Finnish archipelago near Turku.
It's calling you now. Wide-eyed, every color in bloom.
At the beginning of July, it is getting much more crowded, and I have to be more creative in choosing my moorings to be able to continue enjoying the solitude. But with time, you get an eye for every possible and impossible archipelago mooring, and this one here on the island of Getturun is definitely one of the most beautiful places I have had in the archipelago so far. It is said that there are so many saunas in Finland that all Finns can go into a sauna at the same time. And this is probably true because there are between 2 and 3 million saunas here. I experience the often so tight-lipped Finns here as very communicative people who switch to English as soon as they hear where I come from. But when communication gets too much for me, my kayak is a valuable help to escape the hustle and bustle of the full jetties. And it helps me to find other spectacular places. Finland is absolutely unique, and I even spent whole nights here in the pedal solitude of the Turku archipelago.
Yeah, yesterday I had a real low. Now, should I say, I don't like me for it. It's because the harbors are full here, so many people now in July in the holiday season. And maybe I was in too much harbors. And like yesterday, it's 20 boats packed. It's so tight, everywhere people talking and running over your boat.
When it finally gets too crowded, I leave my boat behind for 4 weeks and set off for Germany. The difference could hardly be bigger. A moment ago, I was sitting alone in nature, and suddenly I'm standing with my band on the stages of the crowded German Baltic Sea marinas. But after a month of loneliness in the archipelago, I quickly get used to the touring, and I enjoy this time and the equally wonderful summer here to the full. And before I know it, I'm standing at the airport in Helsinki with my storm jib again and take a bus and taxi back to my lonely boat. But the shock of the return to the loneliness is even bigger. Here in Finland, the summer is over in the middle of August. All boats have disappeared, and I painfully realize that I have to get a move on. I cast off immediately and set sails course Hanko, my port of departure to Tallinn. And I experienced the last dreamlike archipelago sailing of this journey. I must honestly admit that I have fallen in love with Finland. This cruise has the melancholic atmosphere of a farewell, as I realize that I will not only leave Scandinavia soon, but now also slowly start my way back. On one hand, against the main wind directions, west and southwest, and on the other hand, with a lot of distance over the open sea. Summer sailing will become autumn sailing. In Hanko, I moor on the city marina and look around a bit. Von da nach Hanko. But I'm not quite with it anymore, because I'm already planning the crossing to Tallinn in the back of my mind. The itinerary offers one alternative through the inner archipelago, but since I have to keep up, I will take the direct course to Estonia, also mentioned in the text.
It should also be noted that if one so wished, one could sail southeast from Hangu to Hottensholm with a northerly wind.
Hottensholm is now called Osmusar, is only 30 miles away and must have been an important landmark for navigation in those days. Land visibility was extremely important, because even in King Valdemar's time there was no functioning compass on board. Although it was developed in China before Christ as a so-called red compass, it was not until 1300 that it found its way to the Mediterranean, where it was further developed into a dry compass. But only after Leonardo da Vinci gimbal-mounted it in 1534, it could be reliably used on board of ships. And it was not until 600 years later that this further developed compass found its way back to its home country, China. It will not take 600 years, but the wind just won't play along for the crossing to Tallinn, which, with its 60 nautical miles, is a quite long one. I learned about the nearby island of Hauensuoli, which translates as Pike Gut. Apparently, many sailors were waiting here in the Middle Ages, just like me now, for favorable winds, and passed the time by carving messages and coats of arms into the rocks. I would like to have a look at this, but I'm not sure if I can reach the rocks with my sailboat. So what to do? I can then persuade one of the harbor masters to take me across with the decrepit rubber dinghy. For the trip to the island, the air should hold, and soon we are speeding through the rough sea. All over the island I find many of the 640 different rock carvings. This is once again pure mental cinema, and I imagine the different crews before casting off. Our boat has already lost a lot of air again, but my skipper and guide Hendrik drives me back to the harbor with confidence.
I don't know the place name.
Yeah, du Darmen.
An old Viking tradition, I now pack something for the elves in my home village Hamburg. This was important on every journey, as the elves were able to put in a good word for me with Aegir and a run. And to get them really interested, I pack a lot of Lonkoro in the bill. This drink, made from gin and grapefruit juice, was specially developed for the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki and was so well received in Finland that every restaurant now has a tap for Lonkoro next to the beer tap.
It's early in the morning with the rising sun. I'm leaving Hanko, heading for Tallinn in Estonia. And I got a little respect, of course. A new country, I have to go 60 miles over the Bay of Finland.
10 degrees to windward, and it fits perfectly.
Wait, Finland is behind. Estonia, I'm coming. As you might see behind me, there comes a rain front, but there's no wind in it. Contrary, less wind and rain, so I'm happy to be underway now with 5 to 6 knots.
Take a look at my new compass. Circular shaped, a bigger diameter, and an adjusted height of the nail. Now we check it out. The top of the cell phone points directly to the north. It's indeed quite accurate.
But now I'm looking forward to Tallinn, which is announced by the Toompea castle, visible from far away. It was built here by King Valdemar in 1219, after the conquest of Estonia by the Danes, and is therefore the perfect endpoint of my journey.
The manuscript also has a large section on Estonia, which means that this manuscript is fundamental for the study of the early history of Estonia. Many place names in Estonia are mentioned for the first time in this little book.
I moor on the city marina, and so, after almost 4 months, have arrived at the last place of the route description. Because the mentioned Ravelburg is called today in Estonian Danish castle, Tallinn. And in this castle sits the Estonian parliament. I have now reached the easternmost point of my journey. I plan to celebrate my arrival here for a few days and plunge into the pulsating life of this attractive city, because Tallinn is the best preserved medieval city in Northern Europe, and the old town is really impressive. Even though Tallinn is the last place mentioned in the itinerary, the question arises whether the end of the Danish expansion was reached here or whether it was just a base for further expansion towards the Orient. Looking again at the medieval map, the proximity to the Baltic region to the Black Sea and thus to the Orient is striking. All connected by the river Don, which together with the Volga and the Dnieper belonged to the huge river system over which the Vikings, called Varangians in the east, traded with the Orient. The Varangians were particularly fond of precious metal, either as intact coins or simply chopped into pieces. The fortifications around today's Tallinn were important trading centers for silver, which was popular not only with the Estonian Vikings. But before I now turn my bow westwards towards home, I want to question Burkhard Piesky again, who went much further east from here.
It is Viking style to sail in a convoy, so that you can help each other. Unity is strength. Although together we can beat others and we are armed against all enemies.
For several years now, he has been involved in the wonderful Euro-Viking project.
We have converted these voyages with the Viking ships into a youth project where we take socially excluded young people on a 3-week expedition. These young people I have are, of course, very, very far from nature, not to say alienated from nature. Digital people who are suddenly here in the wilderness, in Belarus and in the Ukraine. So after a week, the young people are completely changed. They are participants in an expedition. They all get a job in the meantime. Either they cook, or they're the scout, or they work as a mechanic. And it's important that they get a lot of tribute. In the evenings, we sit around the fire and discuss their teenage and childhood problems. There is something growing together which is unique. We have brought 28 young people to earning a wage, who otherwise would have been welfare recipients for the rest of their lives. So, the Vikings and the journey with the Viking ship under oars, or sometimes even sails, seem to be really personality forming and encouraging. And it is a great thing that the river dictates that to us. Every one of my young people is learning to sail because they don't like rowing so much. Hoist the sails, they all scream, as soon as we have a beam reach, and then take off with speed. Such Viking ship sails damn fast. It's a fantastic sailing vessel.
One often reads that round logs were used to transport the loaded and heavy ships.
It's all in the books, but it's definitely wrong, because we tried it with rolling logs. We had taken logs that were totally cylindrical. They sank into the swamps where we were traveling. Nothing was turning at all. The Vikings went cross-country, through forests, through meadows and swamps and so on. And they had something else on their ships too. What did the Vikings need for transport? Only their axe. Because the transport material grows on the riverbanks, the willow. So they took off branches with the axes and they threw this wicker truncheons of various lengths, about an arm's length or a metre long, in front of the ship, directly across the ship. And the keel of the ship then tore open the willow bark and the ship slid on the slimy, soapy layer of the bark mulch.
In the Chronicles of Nestor, monks report how so-called Rus went ashore from across the sea in the second half of the 9th century.
Their swords have blood grooves. From the nail up to the neck, they are tattooed green with trees and other images.
It says in Islamic chronicles. In the beginning, they established a trading base at Lake Ladoga, east of today's St. Petersburg. At first, the Slavic natives defended themselves against the Vikings from the area of today's Sweden. But those fought so bravely until the Slavs capitulated and even demanded the following.
Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes, rule over us.
Soon after, the Rus founded Novgorod and Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, and then sold the Slavs in large quantities as slaves. There had been an infrastructure of carriers along the river systems, which made the transport of the boats possible.
Yes, the Vikings were very pragmatic, and they certainly had no personal problems either. They needed a lot of people for their travels, and they had them too. And when they didn't have enough, they hired Slavs, for example, who were found there. It wasn't an empty country in the east, and they certainly paid them for their help. But it must have been so incredibly hard. And for me, that's a sign that these people were in harmony with nature. They knew exactly which natural phenomena to exploit, and they could surely read a river.
But there are more and more indications that not the own heavy Viking ship was towed over land, but that in the course of the journey, which could last years, the goods were reloaded onto smaller ships or even sledges. Over the big Russian rivers, the Vikings reached Serkland at the Caspian Sea. But most important was probably Miklagard, Constantinople, the highlight of every journey, with its huge markets and tens of thousands of people. Surely a sensation for every Viking who could earn a fortune here with only one journey.
And now I'm on my way back. I didn't really think about it beforehand, but now I have to find my way back again. Next stop will be Ventspils in Latvia, and then I go over to Gotland.
For me, it's now course west. From now on, with a few exceptions, I will have either lots of wind or rain or a combination of both, and have to fight my way through the Estonian Moon Sound to the legendary island of Saaremaa, then called Ösel. That was feared throughout the Baltic Sea region for its large pirate fleet.
Kommt mit aneinander und da ist schon irgendwer. Da gibt was auf die Mütze. Wir sind Wikinger.
But there are other stories about Saaremaa. The stories of the Viking gods written in the Snorri Edda in Iceland are set on the island of Thule on the edge of the North Sea. This could now be Iceland, but possible an island of Norway, the Shetland Islands or the Faroe Islands too. But also Saaremaa could be the island Tulesar, mentioned in the Edda, where a big fire strikes. Because the Estonian word Thule means fire. And indeed, 4,000 years ago, a huge meteorite struck here on Saaremaa. The main crater, located in a grove near Kali, has a diameter of over 100 meters and is 20 meters deep. Around the impact crater, there are 8 smaller secondary craters. This huge impact left traces in Scandinavian and even Greek records.
Surtra moves from the south with a scathe of branches. There shines from his sword the son of gods of the slain. Stone peaks collide together, troll wives take to the road, warriors tread the path from hell, and the heavens break apart.
And it gets even more fabulous. Let us take a closer look at the supreme god of the Vikings, the Allfather Odin.
Every morning, Odin rides his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, with his faithful ravens across the morning sky and explores the world. Odin is relentless in his search for wisdom. In Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, the well of wisdom springs forth under the care of Mimir. Mimir promises Odin all his knowledge in exchange for an eye, and so Odin then sacrifices his eye and throws it into the well in order to attain eternal wisdom.
Now it is said that the local meteorite crater could be this very source of wisdom, at the foot of the world ash Yggdrasil, and that the great fire was caused by the impact of Odin's eye. Around the craters, ash trees still grow today that do not exist on Iceland. Maybe this magic potion from outer space in the crater near Kali is the secret of the unconquerable inhabitants of Saaremaa. I have to process this first and moor my boat in Abruka, a small island in front of the only town on Saaremaa, Kuressaare. In the last night of August, many fires are lit here, because today is the night of the ancient lights, a holiday in Estonia. I feel a bit queasy in view of the signpost and the indicated kilometers, but I must have a look at something here. The Vikings did not suddenly appear in world history with their attack at the end of the 8th century on a monastery in Lindisfarne. Their sophisticated boats, their weapons and their tactics had developed long before that. And a trace of earlier expeditions was found here on Saaremaa.
On my way from Tallinn to Gotland, I made a stop over on the island of Saaremaa, former known as Ösel, and it was absolutely feared throughout the centuries in the Baltic region. My first stopover is here at Salme, where about 10 years ago 2 ship graves had been found, which are a pretty good sign that even bigger Viking raid had been kicked their asses here.
The first excavated ship was a light rowing boat on which 7 skeletons with some personal belongings were found, including many combs. A comb was worn on the belt of every Viking, because hair was considered as the seat of the soul, and hair care was therefore immensely important to them. The surprise came, however, when a second ship was discovered only 30 meters further on. Almost all the wood had rotted, but the position of the iron rivets made it possible to get an idea of the boat. And in the middle of the boat there was a pile of wood, iron and traces of fabric. Have the Vikings used the wind already 100 years before Lindisfarne? Never before have older Viking ships been excavated than these here in Estonia. The 33 dead on board the larger ship obviously had a higher status. They were neatly piled on top of each other, carrying weapons, combs made of elk antlers and sacrificed animals. Finally, they were covered with their shields. These men must have been a fearsome bunch. With their height of more than 1.8 meters, they towered above almost all their contemporaries. They were covered with a large number of pieces of the Vikings' most popular board game, the Hnefatafl. And now it's getting exciting. While those below carried simple iron blades as weapons, those above were equipped with double-edged swords with richly decorated handles. The most impressive of these even carries jewels on its handle. It lay next to a young man with the king's chess piece in his mouth, whose face was turned towards all other men of the funeral. Was this man possibly a king himself?
The men of Estland came down from the interior with a great army, and there was a battle. But the army of the country was so brave that the Swedes could not withstand them. King Ingvar fell, and his people fled.
An old Scandinavian legend tells us. To assume the deceased as Ingvar now would be pure speculation. But the findings show that such events actually took place. I leave the beautiful Estonia and sail to Ventspils in Latvia. From here, I have the shortest distance to Gotland, but at the same time, the longest of my journey with 89 nautical miles. As a single-handed sailor, without a strong engine on board, you can't just sail away. You have to plan that well. The first German records of a crossing from Windau, today's Ventspils, to Hoburg, at the southern tip of Gotland, were found in the so-called Seebuch from the 14th century. Instead of Hoburg, I choose Hervik in the center of the east coast of Gotland as my port of destination, because here you are able to enter safely, even with a strong easterly wind.
I want to check out in a kind of experimental way why the people tend to take the route through the archipelago. Today it's a long turn over to Gotland, and let's see how my boat behaves. Sailing yacht La Mer, I want to leave the harbor. Am I free to proceed?
Yes, you have permission.
first, the cruise starts very relaxed, and I prepare myself for the long trip.
Some words about single-handed sailing. I really love to do nothing. So I'm completely happy when the boat does everything by itself. So if the wind's steady and my autopilot does all the work, so I can run around on my boat, like cooking here or closing my eyes, reading, just let the time pass.
During the night, it starts to rain, and the wind freshens up more and more. The waves get higher and higher, and I put a reef on the sails. I have never experienced such a swell in the Baltic Sea before. And I'm really happy to have chosen a safe harbor. I enter surfing on the waves, and after 24 hours, I instantly fall into a happy sleep. I have reached Gotland, and I'm back in Sweden now.
And it started pretty easy and became very, very rough in the end. And it's not about the wind, it's more about the waves in that area here, which became pretty high and pretty rough. And I can easily understand now why people with smaller boats at least choose to go the long way, following the old route description. And even if you are a trader, you want to trade and it does not make sense to see fishes and birds.
In the old sagas, there are reports of islands that only appeared on the water at night. During the day, there was only impenetrable fog. And Gotland was also one of these enchanted islands, until Tjelvar, the discoverer of Gotland, managed with the torch to stop the every morning sinking. And today I was really glad that the island was where it should be. The next morning, the wind is gone, and I start to circle Gotland around the North Cape. Thanks to its strategic location in the Baltic Sea, Gotland has always been an important trading center towards the east. Archaeologists have discovered at least 50 harbors from the Viking Age here. The trade was mainly non-violent in order to maintain the precious trade relations. Like the managers of multinational corporations, they stimulated early medieval world trade and shone as capitalists, traders and explorers. Experts believe that the Swedish island in the Baltic Sea has the highest treasure density in the world, which is why the use of metal detectors or even simple digging can lead directly to prison. In 1983, a Gotlandic farmer plowing found the largest Viking treasure ever found, made of 70 kilograms of silver. This big silver treasure is completely exhibited in the Fornsal Museum in Gotland's capital Visby, my last destination before returning to Germany.
Into that deep blue abyss.
But before that, I experienced 3 dreamlike sailing days on Gotland's coast.
Never really felt that alone to me. Never really felt that alone. I got it. I got that feeling again. So I got out. I put my windows down. It never really felt that alone to me.
In the north, I passed the biggest connected rauk field in Sweden. Rauks are petrified remains of animals that lived here hundreds of millions of years ago, coral reefs. In Likershamn, I can see a very famous rauk. According to the legend, a mighty man, called the Wise Man, lived here with his daughter over 1,000 years ago.
From a sea voyage, the wise man brought back a young prisoner who grew up with his daughter until love came into play. Thereupon, the wise man announced that the young lover could only marry his daughter if he succeeded in freeing her from the top of the tall rauk. The young man bravely climbed up from the shore, but when he grasped her hand, the wise man sent a strong gust of wind, and the lovers fell into the sea at the foot of the rock that has since been called Jungfrú Rauka.
Savor it, 'cause these times will pass you by, feeling rich, even when the money's tight. Don't forget that it's a lonely thing.
And then I reached the beautiful Visby. This medieval town is a real feast for the eyes, and I take a close look at every corner of the old town. In the museum, then, I am impressed by the variety and quantity of coins found here on Gotland. About 70,000 coins from the Arabic area were found. Coins from the whole Roman Empire, from the big mint in Baghdad, even a coin with an inscription to Moses. Impressive and a real testimony to the intensive trade relations with the entire Orient. However, the Vikings were never interested in coins, only in the pure precious metal, and so the coins were often melted down into bracelets. The Viking Age has left more artifacts here on Gotland than anywhere else in the world. On different types of stones, the development of the Scandinavian boats over the centuries can be followed well. From simple rowing boats from the 5th century to the first appearance of the sail in the 7th century, you can find images on Gotland that are a goldmine for scientists and archaeologists. The runestones, however, carry more illustrations than important writings.
Geirmund married Geirlaug when she was a girl, had a son before Geirmund drowned and the son died. Then she married Gudric and they had children. But only one girl survived. Her name was Inga. She married Ragnfast from Snatsta, then that one died, and her son died, and Inga inherited from her son.
It is impressive to see how much the social structure of the Viking Age depended on the woman, whose sons and husbands were sometimes absent from their farms for years and very often never to return at all. An Arab envoy describes a meeting with Norsemen by the river Volga, in which women also took part. These had carried a box on the chest. Only the women of Gotland carried these chest boxes. So, did they accompany their men on their travels through Russia? Here is a vivid interpretation of a shield maiden. This is what the female warriors of the Vikings were called. She is inspired by the grave find of a Finnish warrior woman traveling on Russian rivers. But now it's time to say goodbye to Gotland, and thus to my unique journey.
I'm leaving Gotland behind. One of these days I've missed for 14 days and got a nice breeze around 4 before, apparently half wind, so I'm doing 5 knots. Tomorrow I will meet my old course and then the circle is finished. And then I'm going home, see my wife again, my friends again. I'm really looking forward for this.
I once again tie up my lines in Koseberga to express my respect and thank the Vikings for this awesome journey in their footsteps. In the middle of April, I already sat here at this biggest ship setting in Scandinavia, full of curiosity and travel fever.
Yeah, funny to think what happened. Meanwhile, I found so many nice routes through the archipelago. I learned so much about the Vikings, and I managed to sail the whole route. In good old Viking tradition, you have to remove the dragon heads when you go to your hometown, to your home harbor, thinking about everything I saw at this quite magical place. And maybe I got the helping hands of the Vikings with me, because I'm not home, but yeah.
I wings to fly, build me a boat that can carry two.
An unforgettable welcome, even as I almost set my boat on fire with a flare. But I survive even this last hurdle and make my boat fast at home, month after my departure.
And she sails the sea.
From my first journey, I already know that only few people can imagine how I feel now. And I don't try to explain it anymore, and just mingle with the crowd. Play my songs with the band, give an interview for a maritime radio show, and give my wife a hug at every opportunity. I am happy about the wonderful journey and the successful return. And I hope that the Vikings will accompany me again on my next planned voyage across the North Atlantic, because there I can certainly use their help.
And love is pure, the sweetest flower. When first it's new, when seasons change, hope feels estranged. Those tears will dry like summer dew. Build me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row. My love and I, and both shall